Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. As Lane mentioned, extension educator for forest-dependent wildlife, here today to present on integrating wildlife management considerations into early successional forest habitat design. I've worked with you in that capacity, a number of you, in the past for the sake of early successional habitat for golden warbler and American woodcock. And today we'll be spreading our wings a little bit wider and examine the intricacies and range of habitat considerations for wildlife management in early successional forest habitat, and emphasize strategies that balance silvicultural objectives with ecological and wildlife outcomes, and touch on biological legacies and the concept of that, and the importance of recognizing and retaining them from the previous stand into future iterations of the stand post-harvest, and retention considerations about orientation, distribution, size, and use to protect wildlife habitat features and other critical ecological features on the landscape. And consider management strategies that incorporate multiple goals and objectives. And so, as we dive into it, we'll talk quite a bit about the critical features that we're trying to protect and, how we're emulating natural disturbance in our forests, and really those natural disturbances can be large and small scale in severity. And fire, wind throw, insect outbreaks, they alter forest structure and composition, creating complexity and diversity at multiple scales. And they can differ greatly in the ecological conditions and structural elements that persist. As we know, each site is unique and kind of represents a range of interactions, ecological processes, events like wind throw, fire, insect outbreaks, beaver flowage, that leave quite a bit of diverse elements on the landscape. And we want to kind of try to begin understanding the importance of those for a number of reasons, not just for wildlife. So biological legacies, as it's kind of imagined in ecological silviculture, are the organisms, organic materials, and organically generated environmental patterns that persist through a disturbance from the previous stand and incorporated into the recovering ecosystem. And there's three kind of main concepts around that, which is lifeboating. It's kind of survival and persistence of plant and animal populations. Those can be reproductive structures, individuals, seeds that perpetuate, plant species, and then a biotic support system, which is kind of the maintaining of those energy flows and nutrient cycles, as well as protecting microclimate conditions. So there's a lot of regimes and considerations and cycles that go into that, everything from shade and moisture to kind of nutrient flows. And structural enrichment as well, because it's not just about, those biotic elements or living elements, but often about some of that complexity in terms of dead structures, fallen logs, strategically placed residual live trees around critical elements to create those ecological niches and protect wildlife habitat features, but also to soften the matrix and provide connectivity both within and to adjacent stands, so that we can have like a connected landscape and facilitate resilience and movement of species. So, biological legacies provide for a significant continuity in ecosystem composition, structure, and function between those forest generations, as we mentioned, and to define a wide range of elements, from large trees and snags down logs, patches of refugia at different forest strata, things like vernal pools, seed banks, and fungal networks, kind of a whole range of things that are critical, not just to wildlife, but ecosystem function, biodiversity, and the resilience of the stands to stress and climate change. So as we consider management strategies and retention priorities, we need to learn how to recognize, the highest quality and critical features to preserve into future generations of the stand. And so just want to plug where a lot of this information comes from. There's a number of sources as I go through here that you'll see mentioned in the slides. But as we kind of consider things from an ecological and biological perspective, just want to plug Ecological Silviculture Foundations and Applications, Brian Palick, Tony D'Amato, Jerry Franklin, Norman Johnson. Really, in my mind, a groundbreaking resource that I encourage folks to utilize that describes benefits not only ecologically, but also to forest wildlife. And it really is an integration and meeting of methods that benefits a range of considerations. So really to start, we're creating heterogeneity across the landscape and emulating natural disturbance. So we look at that through multiple lenses of diversity, and perhaps the first of which is horizontal and vertical structure. And that's really starts with tree retention. We're going to talk about a number of different elements here, but tree retention is one of those first things that we can consider as we manage stands. It provides essential forage and browse sites, as well as structures, den, roosting, nesting cavities. And tree retention also preserves critical food sources and seed sources for less common trees, mast for wildlife. They're a structural and biodiversity element. And some of those large diameter trees persist and become quality snags and coarse woody debris. And again, as I mentioned, maximize those ecological niches to fulfill wildlife life cycle requirements. And wildlife at the end of the day, to break it down to the simple as often as possible here, requires food, water, shelter, and space. And that may change throughout their life cycles. So we consider multiple forest strata, spatial distribution, and species diversity. And we can orient that retention to protect sensitive features. Patches or clumps can protect vernal pools, slopes, and ravines, as well as promoting diversity. And we can orient them as well, not just to protect features, but to, retain things like advanced regeneration or tree species inclusions like softwoods that maybe are a little bit more rare in our stand and in our neighborhood. And again, to promote that connectivity between internal and external features of the site. And they're also important for water quality and soil health considerations. At the end of the day, it again all circles back to ecosystem resilience and forest health. So we're creating that range of goals to retain species of various ages and diversity and promote, habitat use and resilience in our stands. So tree retention considerations, a range of sizes and conditions should be considered, emphasizing retention of dominant and codominant large trees. Things are wind firm and vigorous, though we may consider ones that are slightly larger or smaller because we want a range of sizes, although large diameter trees, as I'll get into, are extremely important, and they will persist into the next rotation and create a continuum of trees and snags available for wildlife. Dispersed versus aggregate both have benefits. And we'll talk about those in a moment. The Minnesota Forest Resource Guidelines, I just want to mention, are a minimum and not necessarily best management practices for wildlife. They guide for 5% or 6 to 12 trees per acre, but that can be highly variable depending on, the size of the trees and the age of the stands that we're going in and managing. Talking to a number of professionals across the field and diving into a number of resources, about 10% retention is a lot more beneficial for wildlife and also forest health and resilience, but that's going to vary based on the size and shape of the site and your goals. We're not necessarily here to pound the table for additional retention, but to present the fact that it is very beneficial ecologically and biologically. And then there's other things we can do like edge feathering, which creates that gradual transition, some additional habitat for some of those edge nesting or using species and avoids a hard edge or an abrupt change into that adjacent forest. Tree retention is really important to consider as we're for the reasons I mentioned, but also like in deciding what trees to retain. So healthy residuals, this isn't necessarily a perfect picture, but we want them not to be, on the edge of death or lacking wind firmness. I know sometimes that flies in the face of, we want to retain these wolf trees or habitat trees that are high quality for the sake of cavities. So in some cases they may be slightly declined, but we want them to persist at least a little while. Another thing I'll point out too is that, a robust crown, provides additional nesting spaces. So looking not just at the diameter of the tree, but the crown size and shape can be valuable. And trees will have some defects that are important for wildlife, cavity, especially. But additionally, you might notice that there's large nests for, like raptor nests in the trees. And those, might be trees you want to retain as well. So consider tree health and vigor, some of those wildlife elements you can notice, wind firmness, desirable species, of course, and other things like erosion benefits that protect the site integrity as well. So insofar as dispersed versus clumped retention, there's been a lot of debate. I've had conversations with people many times over. There's value to both, is essentially the takeaway. Clumps and patches preserve and protect biological legacies, especially those that are perhaps, standing snags are a little dangerous to leave during timber harvest. We can orient some of our patches around those to kind of limit the risks, but still retain them. They retain critical elements of the previous stands that perpetuate into the next generation. But dispersed allow you to select for priority species that are also seed and mass producers and provide that structure throughout the stand. And you can select a little bit more intentionally for tree size, growth form, and to protect those wildlife trees. So there's so many different elements as well, that one approach is better at than the other. Another thing that aggregate retention benefits is the ability to retain multiple elements in multiple forest strata, and structurally intact habitat patches of refugia from that previous stand, that can then persist, and provide some of those elements into the regenerating stand. But dispersed allows for distributed, coarse woody debris, as well as those individually retained trees age and maybe one day fall over, and distributed sources of arboreal energy to maintain below ground processes as well, because sometimes it's not just the resilience and health of the stand is not just what's happening above ground, but below ground as well. So, we can do both in this setting, but it's not necessary every time to be uniform and perfect in our distribution. To quote Alexis Grindy from NRRI, messy forestry is good forestry, especially for wildlife. And there is no silver bullet as far as retention. I mentioned 10% aggregate being more optimal, but in a small site, that might not always be the case. In speaking to a number of researchers, 9 to 10 square feet of basal area was mentioned, but that may fluctuate as well. And just the difference between 9 and 10 feet, 9 inch and 10 inch trees as far as basal area go can be relatively profound. You can see in the table here, 5 trees or 8 to 10, 11 trees difference. So what we're really trying to do is preserve these internal elements and create diversity in our stand, for a number of factors and reasons. And really understanding our native plant communities can be a huge asset in determining what's appropriate to leave as well. Not just native plant, but the biological communities that use those. We can get lost in this pursuit of metrics and perfect silver bullet management. But sizes and shapes of stands are unique. The characteristics are unique. And our goals are not merely to meet a retention percentage every time, but to ensure diversity and preservation of those features and ecological functions. Understanding the features and diversity or lack thereof within your stand can help you begin to make those strategic decisions. And of course, you'll need to balance them with your own goals. Some of our goals include, getting resources from that stand, and we can't always hit these biological and ecological, perfect metrics as well. So we really need to, have that push and pull between what our motivations and goals are. And I'll say it again and again. I think this may be the last slide that I have it, but messy forestry is good for wildlife. Oh, and one more thing, take a gander at where you exist in the landscape. Sometimes there's priority focal areas for a certain species. And, understanding your distribution within the landscape can help you understand if there's some things that you need to be considering, for at-risk species or habitat elements. So, just wanted to take a quick look at, a project that I helped manage at Tamarack National Wildlife Refuge. It will be through the lens of golden wing warbler, American woodcock, some of those other young forest species in deciduous forest setting. But we start at the neighborhood. It's kind of a good lesson that takes us to, multiple elevations as we plan our project. And neighborhood and landscape considerations are really important. So as we understand what our goals are with the site, we also look at cover type and age distribution, size and shape of the stand, again, those priority species. And does it make sense to utilize different management strategies within a certain area? Perhaps there's a small scale area, 40 to 70,000 acres. You might utilize an approach called dynamic forest management. That's, the brainchild of Jeff Larkin out of the University of Indiana, Pennsylvania, where you could take different approaches in different areas to target benefits for a range of species that may utilize them. So really understanding what is the communities that are occupying your sites and the cover types that you're managing in may drive some of what you want to choose to do in those areas. And whether or not the stand has unique elements as well. So in this particular case, we have 50% forest cover within a half mile, which is essential for golden wing warblers. So that contiguity is very important. It's also important in some cases too, if you don't have much forest refuge in the area, you have a fragmented landscape, to be intentional about retaining more in that scenario, because that forest structure may be even more important and critical. For a number of reasons, in addition to nesting species or as stopover habitat. Um, so as we were managing, we looked at conifer component within the adjacent area. Less than 30% is desirable for golden wing warblers. A mix of mature and early successional deciduous forest stages, because we want to understand if those young forest species are actually in the area, because they have a relatively high site fidelity. So they come back to within about a mile of areas they've nested in the past. And then zooming into the actual site, again, deciduous forests at this point, about 20 to 30%. Is how we understand that, like, yes, we're going to target this for our deciduous forest species like golden wing warbler. We need adjacent mature forest though, because within the annual life cycle, it's not just about the young forest patch. Golden wings utilize the adjacent stand as the chicks fledge and before they complete that first migration. So this was a non-commercial treatment with alder in the lowland area. There's kind of an elevation in the middle of the site, and more mature forest in the upland, but a lot of beaked hazel as well. And so the intention of this project was to create young forest habitat, but also try to get the stand to start regenerating more to tree species. We chose not to do a management in blocks approach, which is often 20 to 25% rotated throughout the site. And we distributed our leaf trees individually and as patches. There's about a half acre opening or a little bit more in the north to south. Those are great for woodcock singing grounds and courtship areas. And again, like we weren't using a lawnmower and manicuring the stand. We practiced some messy retention. And this site will be utilized for 10 to 12 years by those young forest species, but then it'll start to grow in. And that retention can be even more important as it succeeds to mid-stage, wildlife communities. And so the species that utilize it first from a young forest setting, and this may change slightly as we, go to more mixed forest and fully conifer forests. But a range of species utilize not just the ground for nesting, like golden wing warbler, American woodcock, sedge wren, but also that shrub layer as well is really important. White-throated sparrow, chestnut-sided warbler, yellow warbler, mourning warbler, alder flycatcher, a range of species, many of which are species of greatest conservation need, utilize multiple forest strata, that ground, that shrub layer, as well as the retained trees that you sprinkle throughout the site and those patches. If we were managing a stand for specifically a commercial stand, for a species like golden wing warbler, that scattered retention is actually more ideal for their use of the site. As you get about 50 to 100 meters away from the forest edge, or especially 50 to 80 meters, you really start to get to the point where if you're isolated in the middle of the site more than about 120 feet away from that forest edge, you're going to get less occupation of wildlife species unless you leave some of those structural elements, those biological legacies protected out there. The optimal target for golden wings is 10 to 15 trees per acre, but that's trees greater than 9 inches DBH. Smaller diameter trees will need to be intentional to retain more. And so, again, feathered edges are a really important consideration. And as I go through here, I'm going to switch more into key habitat elements. This is a list from the Forestry for Minnesota Birds Conservation Guide. It's bird species specific. I recommend people to take a look at the guide. It's super valuable and fun to create deep dives for yourself into additional resources, which it links to. But it does a great job of breaking down the state in terms of habitat associations and cover types, and some things you can do in different forest settings, but also description of what the key structures and features are in our habitats and why they're important, which I'll get into a few, like large diameter trees, conifer, snags, and some water features and elements. And you can utilize the tweaks that I mentioned here, are available in the guide. And as we begin to design our silvicultural strategies and our goals for our sites, we can begin to, protect for some species of greatest conservation need and for the integrity of our wildlife communities. And so sometimes that just involves incorporation of a few considerations about how to protect some of that internal structure and carry that connectivity and contiguity forward within our site and for the sake of our connecting to adjacent stands. So let's touch first on the importance of softwood inclusions, especially in our deciduous forest habitats or mixed forest habitats. They can provide really important thermal cover, tree species diversity and structural complexity, which allows for a range of different species perhaps to occupy our sites. It's year-round shelter and cover. Species like deer, a range of songbirds, grouse, and moose where they occur, small and medium mammals. Their nest nesting sites and forage sites for a number of species. And they can be reserved through, subsequent stages and entries, especially some of those long-lived ones. Consider legacy trees, especially softwood inclusions as legacy patches that may persist not just through one rotation, but multiple rotations, especially if they happen to be included in, aspen stands, which are often managed on short rotation. And some of these species too, highly critical. Northern white cedar is really hard to get to regenerate in our stands. We may talk about that in future education here through SFEC or other extension programming. But it's important thermal cover, provides winter browse. Tamarack as well is in decline. If you have, robust and healthy remaining stands of that, there's a balance of whether or not to cut it before it gets hit, but in some cases it may be important to retain. White pine, obviously a very important species as well, often great for cavity-dependent wildlife or nesting for raptors. Or escape trees for bears, roosting trees for wild turkeys. So a lot of the elements I'm going to talk about today are interconnected. Some of our softwood inclusions become high quality, large diameter trees that will retain. And even if they don't, large diameter trees are highly critical for wildlife. Also, ecosystem resilience, mass production, seed sources for future stands, trees for raptor nesting. And sometimes, they're not always just the tree species that you'd think, those long-lived conifers or oaks. Aspen can be a very high quality retention tree for cavity nesters, and for species like goshawk who'll nest at the crotch within the crown. So they're essential habitat features that contribute to stand structural diversity, but are also important for carbon storage and forest resilience. So when looking in the constant search for metrics, at least one tree greater than 18 inches retained per acre and three greater than 12 can be incredibly important and valuable to the stand. They're that I've mentioned most of what's here, but another consideration to some of these large diameter trees are the fungal associations that occur underground, like ectomycorrhizal associations. So, you know, if you see some of those large diameter trees, it's perhaps one of the most important things you can do to retain a few of those. They then become high quality snags. They may already be high quality cavity trees. And so, to transition into our cavity trees, they are basically wildlife hotels. Living cavity trees and dead standing snags are just, incredibly essential for wildlife. Retention of them can be challenging, I know, especially snags for logger safety concerns. So sometimes a legacy patch can provide protection to that, as well as other, features on the landscape, and really allow us to try to be intentional about protecting some of those features. Another interesting element to those legacy patches, especially as it pertains to cavity trees, is often it provides a little bit of cover as well from some adjacent trees, and species will actually really like to use standing snags that have some of that adjacent structure as protection. It also provides a little bit of thermal covers for that cavity so it doesn't get too warm. And when they're not present, those large diameter trees, those high quality trees with the potential to become, standing snags and cavities can be really important. So um, I I encourage you to dive into. It was really a great exploration of different trees that or species that utilize these trees. Fishers are a great example, though, of why to have a number of them in the area. They'll use one as their natal den or maternal den, and then they'll abandon it and use others, or some dens on the ground as well could be possible as maternity dens as their young age and before they go out on their own. So, having more than one or orienting them in distribution throughout a site and throughout the landscape can be highly important. And they're used by just a range of species for a number of reasons. And one last thing on that note is they can be really important microsites for invertebrates as well. So I'll try to point people towards some additional information as it comes out, but NRI is doing some studies on microsite use within those cavity trees, and it's highly fascinating. So, you know, I think it's really interesting too that there's a range of use of cavity tree between cavity trees and snags, where live trees are often used quite a bit by certain species. In this case, northern long-eared bat and fisher prefer them over, clearly dead trees. That said, they will utilize those like dead standing snags, and other species do as well, like certain woodpecker species. Um, some prefer deciduous versus conifer trees. So it really just points to kind of the importance of retention of a range of different species. And again, species that are considered not wind firm, like aspen, actually are really important cavity tree for fisher and woodpeckers. Mike North is doing some studies right now on the aspen used by different woodpecker species, and it hopefully we'll be able to bring some of that information to you in the near future. So, in addition, our retention is kind of, again, not in isolation of elements, but they are a range or continuum of elements. So our retention trees become high quality standing snags at some point, or break and become downwoody debris and material, and are important for nutrient cycling and moisture retention in our landscape, in addition to serving the wildlife community. So downwoody material, also referred to as fine or coarse woody debris, um, historically very common in our forest stands. So when possible, retain scrap or cull material from harvest operations. Similar to live trees and snags, large diameter downwoody material is ideal, and a range of sizes can be beneficial. Avoid damaging it when possible, often difficult during timber harvesting. And just like our standing trees and snags, diameters over 18 inches are great to retain when we can. Perfect metrics of, the amount of material on the landscape are difficult to come by. Though I think anyone going into a less, managed forest will see that there's an incredible amount of downwoody debris in those habitats that's utilized by a range of wildlife. But for the sake of ruffed grouse, they prefer greater than 8 inches in diameter, greater than 6 feet in length. Hollow logs will often be used for food cache or storage locations or dens. So, consider being careful to retain some of that downwoody debris, because in addition to being used as nest sites or important for nutrient and moisture retention on the site, it's escape cover and predator protection, and can also increase prey abundance for those predator species. So there's a few different ways to do that. Messy forestry is great. Again, sometimes you can create some of these structural elements of downwoody debris through things like wildlife piles. Um, and there's a lot of data on the different sizes and shapes of these. But insofar as they go, deliberately constructed piles of various lengths and diameters can be great natural cover. Generally, guidance I've found, which is highly variable, directs for 10 feet diameter, 3 feet high, but even smaller piles, even piles like 3 feet by 3 feet, can be really important cover for things like for species like snowshoe hare. Um, Distributing those throughout the site, 2 to 3 piles per acre, can be really beneficial. There's some argument about large versus small logs at the base, but essentially you want those little escape pathways and predator protection so that they can be enterable by small and medium mammals along the ground. Birds will utilize them as well, and they can be shelter from weather. There are places where insects are very prevalent, so they provide food storage or forage opportunities and facilitate, again, that safe movement. Utilized by a range of species too, some of which are species of greatest conservation need. I mentioned snowshoe hare, but very white-throated sparrow, winter wren, voles, chipmunk, squirrels. Downwoody debris is essential for salamanders and some other amphibians, frogs, snakes, insects. So just note that like scattering our debris across the landscape is not necessarily, how our how some of like our disturbance events would leave our forest habitats. So we can kind of think about how things might be scattered or piled as we begin to, leave that dead woody debris within our forest setting. So to kind of switch gears a little bit into another important habitat feature, we already protect and buffer our riparian areas, our shorelines. And I think that's extremely important. But understanding where our wetlands and other water features are on our site is equally important, used by a range of species, critical for certain species of salamander and frog, especially vernal pools, ephemeral ponds. So this is a bit of a primer for Spencer Rettler, who will be giving a presentation from 9 to 10 a.m. on the 10th of February. So stay tuned for that. I worked with him a little bit as I put together this information. They're naturally occurring for ephemeral wetlands, generally found in depressions embedded within upland forests of the eastern broadleaf and Laurentian mixed forest regions of Minnesota. They're an early source of water, warmish water, and green vegetation in the spring. But they do really rely on that thermal cover, which is why we're mentioning here. They can perhaps be oriented in the middle of a retention patch. So due to seasonal transitory nature, there's no predation from fish, which makes them just really essential for a lot of those early season salamanders and some turtle species and frogs to, kind of raise their young. They provide essential like early browse and is also like a water resource within a habitat. And for the best delineation, visiting those areas in the spring is ideal because you can get a really good idea of how they're distributed, what their boundaries are. Visiting them later in the year, it's often hard to know exactly what the delineation is, or you could, in some cases, walk through them and not realize they were there. We can't do this in every case. I fully realize that. But insofar as like some recommendations go, they're hard to come by. Talking with Spencer and finding this resource from all the way back in 2013 for high conservation value forests. 50-foot no harvest buffers around pools is ideal with an additional, limited harvest 100-foot buffer around that. Again, realize that's not always something that we can do, but it really just emphasizes perhaps appropriately that these are extremely sensitive features on the landscape. They're very thermal sensitive. Changes in that radiation regime, the amount of sunlight they get can change their temperature, can change the composition of the water. So just be intentional, perhaps, to orient some of your retention around them. Enter them only in frozen soil conditions, if possible. It's really important to minimize that soil impact. Try to prohibit skidding and haul roads and landings around them as well. So, as we visit them in the spring, we can be thinking about that. We can protect them as much as possible, but at the very least, not put haul roads and skid through them. And again, maintaining that shading on them is it's really important to retaining their integrity and use by these species. such as, spotted salamander, four-toed salamander, Blanding's turtle, wood frogs. Um, it retains the thermal regimes, makes sure that communities don't shift greatly, and ensures that the nutrient cycles don't get disrupted. And they're also used quite opportunistically by a range of different species. So as I, begin to draw to a close here, some of the last things I want to say and circle back to is that we are trying to emulate our natural disturbance. Um, and as we talk about all of the intricacies that we can consider, it really helps to bring it back to the simple in the end. That complexity and diversity is king, spatial heterogeneity, species diversity on the landscape, recognition of those internal habitat features that are essential not just to wildlife, but to the site resilience and forest health. So design your prescriptions to mimic those natural disturbance events. They don't leave neat, perfect patterns all the time, so you can practice your messy forestry. Vary the size, shape, and orientation. Understand that it's important to retain elements of different forest strata from the ground to the mid-story to the overstory. Um, the site size and shape will be highly variable as well. So that might guide also into whether or not to use dispersed versus aggregated elements. Retaining perhaps more is even more important in those very large sites where that distance from edge can be, prodigious and difficult, to overcome for many species. And it really ties the site together and maintains that connectivity internally and externally to orient some of those features out in the middle. And it creates that landscape of ecologically rich, wildlife-friendly elements that is resilient to future threats and stressors. So retain a mix of species sizes, ages, and conditions throughout all levels if you can. And again, think about those features that we can protect as we retain those elements because they're highly complex and functionally important, and often take decades to replace or are just not replaced within a human lifetime. So, they can be easy to destroy, but take generations to replace. So as far as final thoughts go, achieving ecological, biological, and resource goals can be really challenging. We're balancing a lot as we consider how to manage our stands, and it's critical for us to get our resources and maintain the integrity of our forest industries as we consider also how to make our sites resilient, good wildlife habitat, and make sure that they are healthy for future generations of the forest stand. And that requires collaboration, adaptiveness, and shared knowledge, and working as a community, collaborating across ownership and management boundaries. Oftentimes, we manage stands and forget about the neighborhood elements or the landscape level elements. Working with our neighbors, county, state, federal, tribal, and private, really helps us create an integrated approach to wildlife management, forest management in general. And it also has benefits from a community aspect and a community learning aspect. So try to incorporate multiple goals into your prescriptions, be adaptive to new information as it's learned, and don't be afraid to try something new. When you do, share that information. Did it work? Were there surprising things that occurred as you, tried this, that, or other in your forest stand? There's new research and monitoring data coming out all the time. Are there new things that we should be prioritizing on our landscape that we learned, or new species that are at risk that we can be considering? And when you do these things and incorporate that management and write those prescriptions, please do consider resources like the Great Lakes Silvicultural Library. Put some of your experiences in management approaches there. It enables the community to learn from each other and work together in the future, and maybe reach out to each other to get some additional insight into what's worked. And finally, before I pause and take some questions, I want to say Thank you very much for your time. But additionally, we are going to be working to bring some future wildlife management considerations and content to you. And if there's topics you'd like us to focus on, um, as we create our future content, really interested in hearing some of your feedback on that and encourage you to reach out to me directly or just bring it up as we jump into questions here. There's a ton of great information out there. If anyone's interested in where I got some of the information that I shared today, please reach out to me and be happy to share that and give you all some time to ask questions. And I can't thank you enough for the opportunity to be here.
Great. Thanks, Peter. We do have a couple questions and comments here. First off, it's like we coordinated this almost. You teed up a lot of the things I wanted to get to, plugging our 2026 webinars and the research review. So thanks for lobbing those softballs for me. Otherwise, some comments here. Christian's comment, I'll just say at 9:31 a.m. I won't read the whole thing, but it's a really insightful comment. One thing he used to do as a field forester was post timber sale, plant conifers in groups rather than scattering them across the stand. Also, maybe marking small trees with the idea that those will be reserved and provide cavities later on in the stand's lifetime. So just a great comment there, a lot of insight. Another question here from Matt Petz, Jaguar. Did these studies adjust for the availability of large cavity trees on the landscape? That is, do cavity-dependent wildlife use large aspen frequently because that's the most common large tree on the landscape? Or is it because they actually prefer aspen over species like maple or pine?
So that's a great point. In seeing a number of different presentations by John Erb, who was one of the individuals who wrote the paper that I referenced, he did mention that in some cases he believed that there was perhaps an opportunistic element to the utilization of those of aspen for the sake of cavity use by fishers. Although in speaking to Mike North recently, they're essential for woodpeckers. And they are quick that, because they get that heart rot, they're essential cavity trees, especially at larger diameters for a number of different species. So though they may be used opportunistically and species like oak, which are longer lived, are important to consider and also high quality cavity trees, aspen should not be overlooked as an important wildlife tree. Additionally, in speaking with Dave Grosich from the Superior National Forest, aspen are just really highly sought after for species like goshawks. They like to nest at the crotches in the canopies of large aspen trees. Those will often get sniped by certain owl species, especially great horned owl. So those aspen really are critical. And though we can't retain them every time, and it's hard to leave them as individuals and dispersed elements in a site because perhaps they'll be pushed over by wind. Understanding what our soils are in our area will help us know if perhaps they have a better chance of surviving there. And aggregate retention can be used to provide some wind firmness protection from blowdown, perhaps because of the protection of the adjacent species. And then just to touch on Christian's comment, which I think is great. Carleton County, there was site visit earlier in October as a part of the Northern Forest Bird Network event, and we saw some gap cuts by Carleton County where they had some leftover white pine that they planted in those cuts. I really like Christian's comment about, being intentional of planting some of those softwoods throughout a site. In talking with the DNR also, they really like to plant some of those clumps that can be used, as thermal cover by rough grouse as well. So sometimes it's challenging to get them to survive, especially if you have intense deer browse in the area. But in some cases, like Carleton County, they actually had pretty decent survival. So it may depend on where you are on the landscape.
Thanks, Peter. And a couple questions about sharing some of these resources. So both Matt asking if there's a publication or cheat sheet that summarizes all these elements and best practices, and then another question of if you'll be willing to make your PDF of your slides available.
I will absolutely make a PDF of my slides available. The cheat sheets are coming. They're a part, and honestly, if folks have thoughts or additional insight into some of what was shared today, I really welcome that. I know that NRRI, I'm hopefully going to be working with them, and the Natural Resources Research Institute out of Duluth, through the U of M, is going to be creating some of these resources, hopefully in partnership with myself. So my desire in the future, being somewhat new to my role here at the U of M, is to create and synthesize some of this information into cheat sheets that can be taken into the woods, kind of checklists of considerations. So a lot of those resources, if not created yet, are on the way. But some of what I can share with you via the bibliography here, via a PDF of this presentation, are some links to a deeper dive into where I got my content, and I'm happy to share that.
Great. And I think just to have it kind of all in one spot, we'll just put that on the December webinar page. So for today's webinar, that's also where I'll put that link here in a moment. That's also where we'll put a recording of this if you wanted to revisit it and kind of further unpack some of this. Just look for that on the December 2025 webinar page.
I will
Another
say
question, yeah.
I will say too, the Forestry for Minnesota Birds Conservation Guide is a great first one-stop shop for a lot of this information. And there's a lot of links to additional information included right in it. So if that link is in the chat, great place to start. You can release your inner nerd because especially the appendices are filled with hot links to additional information. So I really encourage people to start there as well.
So another question here from Casey: Are woody debris or brush piles equally important to fire-dependent and music hardwood forests? Has heard some concern about fuel loading in pine forests.
That is a very good question, and to be honest, I don't have a perfect answer for you. I think coarse woody debris is important, across cover types and habitats, though, orientation of them to limit risk of fire. I completely understand, though. A lot of the literature that I read as I was putting this together and over the years has indicated that there's actually a great amount of biomass from coarse woody debris in those conifer habitats. So again, that just comes down to the balance of objectives and goals by the land manager. Orienting a few of those piles, only 2 to 3 per acre, but really, whatever you can away from some of those other ladder fuels and structural elements that you're retaining in the stand can probably limit the risk. And so, if someone, to be honest, I just don't know that answer perfectly, but I'm happy to look into it and reach out to a few people and get it for you. So please reach out to me after this talk, and I'd be happy to work with you.
Thanks, Peter. And then a couple questions. So you've mentioned in your slides thinking about kind of this landscape scale, but that's with our fragmented landscape, trying to think about management across multiple parcels or boundaries. So a couple questions here from Thomas as well as Ryan related to when you have some of these smaller tracts, like are there recommendations for an individual tract that may only be 2 to 5 to 10 acres, for example, that when as part of a broader landscape can be quite a bit of area. Are there recommendations that you would provide at that small scale that would work as you kind of scale up in the extent?
Um, so I think I understand what the question was. So a small scale, if you can throw a rock and hit the adjacent forest, then internal retention, as you get to about 100 to 150 feet becomes more and more important as you become isolated away from the forest edge. So small sites, internal retention, you might just want to disperse some of those high quality trees and worry less about an aggregated patch unless there's an element you want to protect. Um, as the size of your site gets larger, it becomes more and more critical to incorporate, not just those voluntary site level guidelines, which you'll do in any context, but even perhaps a little bit more so that the internal area of that site gets utilized by a larger number of species. So retain your legacy patches for sure in that case. Um, and so the size and shape of the site, it's not just the size, but the shape. You can have a relatively large site that's snaking through the forest. So you're always able to hit that adjacent stand. So, with a rock. So you might be able to, just orient some trees around some critical features, just hit those, that lower end of that retention range. So really, as you scale up in sight, I guess you scale up in retention. That's my simplistic takeaway. And if that site is a block, square or circular shaped, you're really going to be isolating that middle into what a number of wildlife professionals and partners and researchers have told me is sort of a wildlife dead zone. So really, start to consider what you can do as that distance from edge grows.
Great. Thanks again, Peter. And then, so a couple more questions about vernal pools. So, does the tree species composition in these reserve areas around vernal pools matter, such as deciduous versus coniferous?
That will be a question for Spencer Rettler, who will be giving a presentation in February. I think the short answer to that is that some of the trees around those vernal pools will be a little more adapted to that higher moisture regime. And so, I'm not certain that there's a perfect best tree or trees to leave around them. The key is just to preserve that shade cover around them so that they can maintain, the moisture that accumulates there, and not get like grown in with grass and other species because they've been exposed to the sun and they start to dry out rather than retain that moisture.
Okay. And then similarly, a question from Brian about the minimum size of vernal pools that should be buffered. Maybe that's another question that we should maybe have Spencer answer in our webinar in
I
February.
I think so. I mean, the reality is we can't buffer all our vernal pools, right? So there's sites walking the woods with Aiken County Forestry recently. They're like, if we've buffered every vernal pool, we would only have vernal pool buffers because we have so many of them. So recognizing those, that's why visiting them in spring can be really valuable. You can see ones that are like highly diverse, just like, filled with life. There's vernal pools that can be very small. I think those that retain their moisture for a little bit longer would be more ideal, slightly larger pools. Um, but Spencer will be able to give a better insight into those. And I just want to shout out Christian, who threw the observation in the comments. I believe it was Christian Nelson, I would guess. He was one of the authors on the Forestry for Minnesota Birds Guide, in addition to NRRI, and I think they just did an excellent job. And I just wanted to take a minute to say that.
Thanks. And yeah, on the topic of vernal pools too, again, at our January 14th research and practice review, Sue Eggert will be presenting a poster related to some of her ongoing research related to vernal pools and the different wildlife features and promoting those. So again, I can paste that link as well. But if you haven't already, please also register for our 2026 webinar series. I think we've hit that link a few times. Please also, if you want CEs for the live viewing of this webinar, this is our last one of the year. Our next one is going to be on January 13th, but get your CEs for today's webinar at that Z link in the chat. But I think with that here, we're coming right up on 10. Thanks so much to Peter for a really in-depth, insightful talk.